So what I'm going to talk about is the auditing and regulation of digital assets. In that respect, when you think about digital assets, the very nature of auditing changes. So in the old world, an audit was an examination, an inspection of the books of a company. And in that respect, it looked at things like inventory and what the departments were doing and what the systems were doing, how the recorded transactions were done, the accuracy of those, and effectively how the systems were robust to avoid things like financial fraud or misrepresentation. Essentially, an audit is done to ascertain the accuracy of financial statements provided by any organization. So now let's fast forward and talk about the new world. Well, in the new world, we're going to have digital audits. And in that respect, instead of having ledgers in a company's books, we're moving to a world of distributed ledgers. And in that respect, the physical checking that is done in a traditional audit changes. It changes because you've got to start to look at the code, the smart contracts underlying it. So here on the right of the screen, I've just included one set of code so you can see the complexity that this brings to the equation. Because essentially all the financial information no longer is on a simple ledger, but is actually written in coded format. So auditing and oversight is a process of identification, analysis, and monitoring of effectively the way that digital or the way that assets are moved around an organization and external organizations. And in the financial world, we have independent audits to obviously ensure that these are being done in best practice and most efficient way so that there is no misrepresentation. So that's key. You want to make sure that an audit is free from material misstatement. So what I'm talking to you about is actually a paper that we published, myself and Paul Gregg, on the financial auditing of distributed ledgers, blockchain, and cryptocurrencies, which was published in the Journal of Financial Transformation. So the IT audit already exists. It's a specialist part of the engagement agreement in a traditional audit. And what we find is that actually when auditors come into a company, that they effectively get specialist IT people to look into application logs, databases, and such like. Access logs, network logs, they are already part of the audit system. So why is it necessary to rethink the audit when this is already a specialist part of it? Well, why it's important is actually the financial sector is moving to an all digital world, or at least all digital and or hybrid. And this is happening whether you're talking about investments, whether you're talking about retirement and pensions, mortgages, or bank accounts with things like open banking and such like. So code is now in every aspect of your financial transactions. But importantly, we're now moving to a world where we are being a lot more distributed in terms of the ledgers that we have. They're no longer centralized in, for example, a bank or a central counterparty. So what we have to ask ourselves is, are the internal controls that exist in corporations able to audit these new innovations, and particularly blockchain, which is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. So blockchain at its most simple is really just a chain of code that is linked together cryptographically by secure and private cryptographic keys, which means that that blockchain is able to store and transmit digital data, and in particular digital assets. Now, most of you will know the blockchain from Bitcoin, and in fact, it was only really popularized by the non-Diplom Nakamoto in 2008. So this is a fairly new introduction to the financial nomenclature. And in that respect, auditing and financial accounting hasn't had time to adapt to it. It hasn't really grasped what this means, and certainly in terms of jurisdictional legislation, we find that things like crypto assets present a quite dramatic problem for current legal systems because it can't really cope with it. In fact, Germany is one of the few legislative areas that has, for example, mandated that Bitcoin profits, for example, should be taxable. In America, they don't even consider crypto assets as assets as such. They consider them to be commodities. And there are a number of challenges to the way that we interpret assets transmitted over the blockchain. So what I want you to think of the blockchain is as effectively just a mechanism of how distributed computing works. And when you think of that, then what you need to do is you need to have, in an audit approach, how do you audit a distributed computer architecture? So once you understand that it's not as complicated as it sounds, you then have to just look at what the challenges are. However, in terms of blockchain, it's all very simplistic to say that it's a chain of programming codes linked together, but there is obviously a number of different approaches and iterations of blockchain as to whether or not you're using a centralized database or distributed database, or whether these are permissioned or unpermissioned. So in other words, your layers of security and protocol that go over the blockchain. From an auditing perspective, this means that you have to have adaptive substantive procedures, not just for blockchain itself, but for the type of blockchain and the type of database that you're interpreting to see whether or not the reconciliation process is a good one or a bad one. And as you can see from this table, it's largely an iterative approach, and that's slightly different from a database approach where it's effectively the reconciliation is only there if the data is moved. In other words, the data is there all over the internet, and therefore it has to be iterative. It's something which becomes far more dynamic than interpreting a static database. So static databases are historically vulnerable, but the benefit of a blockchain is its resilience. And so as a result, it's more a case of adapting the audit than actually worrying too much about what the benefits or otherwise of blockchain are. But as I said, blockchain is all over the internet. So in that respect, from a jurisdictional perspective, and remember that an audit is being done jurisdictionally, you have what you call in audit terms multi-location risk. So in that respect, multi-location risk is already addressed in accounting standards by a Statement of Auditing Standards number 107. And the auditor has obviously certain rights and obligations in respect of that, and that requires a centralization of records. So remember what we've said about the blockchain, that it is decentralized, and yet the auditor has a requirement for centralization and for checking that centralization. In a decentralized world, you can't do that. So what you have to do is you have to adapt your control environment, and you have to obviously change the frequency of monitoring to adapt and understand where the materiality in that location is. So it may well be that, for example, a crypto asset, ultimately the veil of ownership may lead to a Cayman Island domicile or something like that, but obviously that might not be the materiality of it. So again, the fact is that although these are digital assets, they always have some point of contact with the physical world. Someone must have created them somewhere. So most talked about issue in blockchain is the anonymity and the visibility of blockchain, particularly with crypto assets. And sure, a lot of crypto assets are used for fraudulent, illegal, or potentially evasion reasons. However, the reality is that actually the regulatory and compliance aspect are something that when you're doing the audit, hopefully there is an audit trail which will lead somewhere. Remember that although we talk a lot about the anonymity of a blockchain, at the end of the day, it's out there in the public domain. It's just that you can't work out what the hash or who the hash belongs to, but you can still go back to the orphan block, and you can still, using things like principal component analysis, for example, do clustering techniques, which can ultimately find out who beneficial owners are. So it's not as anonymous as the press necessarily make out. Now, currently, regulations and audit are all focused on finite periods of time. We audit accounts at 31st of December, or whatever the accounting period is. In a digital world, does that make much sense? I would argue it doesn't. I would argue that at some stage in the future, we will move to real-time auditing. At the moment, we're going to be at a hybrid of that, but the auditor has to face that challenge. The speed with which digital assets can move really presents a challenge, particularly when there is this pseudo visibility, if I can call that, and pseudo anonymity that exists. Blockchain is heralded as something that can't be changed. It's malleability. However, the reality is, again, a bit like its anonymity, that it is actually more malleable than the pundits make out. There's a lot of academic research there. I've put one reference here, Broby et al. 2015, who show that actually with the transaction ID algorithm, that actually it is possible to modify a transaction. So as much as we'd like to think that something like Bitcoin or whatever is there, there have been things like a DAO attack, which is very famous, that have shown that there is malleability in the blockchain. Effectively, a blockchain is only as secure as your control over the nodes, the points of contact on the internet that blockchain use. And you really do need to control 51% of those to be able to show that it isn't malleable. Not just controlling 51%, but controlling 51% of the active nodes. Because a lot of people own crypto assets passively. They don't actually participate in the governance of many crypto assets. And therefore, that means that there is a vulnerability because people don't understand the nature of how blockchain itself is governed. So time stamping becomes important from an auditor. In other words, when was a transaction made and when was it sent and when was it effected? In that respect, at Strathclyde, we've done some research on time stamping. Myself, Devraj Basu, and another of our colleagues have effectively documented how time stamping blockchains can be done in precision time. Now, the reason for that piece of research, so we use the atomic clock in Teddington to timestamp a distributed ledger test bed. And the reason for that was that essentially, as we move to decentralized marketplaces, price discovery becomes real time. And as a result, you don't get the buyers and sellers matching because the orders miss, even if they're in nanoseconds. So you need to batch orders to get price discovery. So as a result, you want to have a clear timestamping, and your timestamping on your computer is different from the timestamping in the real world because there's a little differential in terms of accuracy. To an auditor, this is really important, particularly if you're looking at financial transactions in the stock exchange. This may sound very esoteric, But if someone can get in front of your order and trade before you with a supercomputer or whatever, they get an advantage. And in fact, high frequency traders do that at the moment. And there are about $5 billion of profits that are being made by hedge funds because of the speed of their computers relative to others in financial stock markets. So this is a very real world problem that comes from something which may be sounding very abstract. There is an advantage. I don't want to go knocking blockchain because blockchain has self-verification. And for audit, that is really good. You know, sort of it's been self-verified. What is an audit is verification. So each transaction, each and every transaction is digitally signed in a blockchain. So this is really a very powerful part of that. And therefore, audit can be integrated into blockchain. It just needs to have standards. And all accounting is a set of standards to follow so that you have robust checks and balances in the way that you look for whether or not there is these material misstatements. So with a blockchain, it sounds by its name that there is one chain of these programming codes all linked together cryptographically, as I said. However, it is possible to fork the blockchain. In other words, take a chain and make a new one from the original one. Now, when you're auditing something, that's the last thing you want to hear, that actually there is Bitcoin and there's Bitcoin Cash, and you start to think to yourself, gosh, you know, sort of how many other iterations of even a single blockchain are there? So effectively, blockchain forks brings in further complications into this. And when a block is verified, some approaches call this mining, for example. When a block is verified, it takes time for it to effectively be verified to a level where it's considered robust enough on the chain itself. So these challenges means that we need specialists who effectively do this part of the IT audit. And when I say this part of the IT audit, if we think about the way finance is going, again, my opinion, but I strongly believe that we will, in hopefully my lifetime and the lifetime of the people listening, that we will move to an all digital currency world. Paper money, really, there is no need for it. And so once we've solved a few issues like the beggar on the street problem, how do you give someone who doesn't have digital access, the ability to sort of take a few coins off you or whatever. Once we've addressed that, there is no reason why we won't move to this far more efficient and potentially secure way of doing things. By the way, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that Bitcoin is going to replace fiat money. There are many challenges with regards to energy consumption in terms of proof of work on a blockchain. Maybe proof of stake is more interesting, and there are far more other approaches to blockchain other than just using raw computing power to make this cryptographic hash. Again, sorry, I'm trying to avoid the technology here, but the point is that I'm trying to get across that there are sort of technological challenges that auditors need to address as we move into this future. And you can't do that without specifying the number of technical issues that are out there. So with an auditor, obviously, one thing that you really want to hopefully detect or hopefully avoid is fraud and silent transactions. And in that respect, obviously, with crypto-based currencies and the blockchain in itself, you can create what are called silent transactions. And again, this really presents a big challenge for the auditors, because if you've got someone intent on fraud, this is a tool which can be manipulated for that benefit, if only because most people don't understand it. And that obviously presents a number of challenges. So Imagine you're a traditional accountant who's doing an audit of blockchain crypto assets. How do you know what, for example, a Tezos crypto asset looks like? Well, you can see it in a wallet and it says Tezos, but how do you know that that is Tezos and it's not a misrepresentation of what Tezos is, for example? So as you can see, there's a lot of challenges, and that's why, again, we need specialization and protocols to address this in the future. Likewise, custody. And in fact, most banks still don't accept cryptocurrencies in their storage and deposits. I think that's a mistake. There are some banks in Switzerland that are starting to do that, some banks in Germany. But obviously, there's a problem with how do you secure an asset digitally? What are the backup procedures? What are the security protocols for doing that? But once you look into the real financial world, what you actually find is that there is a hierarchy of sub-custodians that actually exists there. So my bank might accept cryptocurrencies, but the reality is they're not using their own IT infrastructure. They're probably subcontracting that to another, what you call sub-custodian. And that obviously presents, again, challenges, because it's all very well having a sub-custodian in the financial world, because sub-custodians are audited themselves, and the auditor can look at the audit of the sub-custodian. But when you're talking about digital assets, are these sub-custody digital assets themselves audited or not? So you can see the challenges that come from that. Authorized signatories, again, when doing a traditional audit, this is normally an area which is quite worrying. You find that people have left an organization, they're still a signatory on 10 of the bank accounts, because most people ignore those bank accounts and nothing ever goes in or out of those bank accounts. In a digital world, that becomes even more important, because it's not a case of going with a signature and going to a bank and doing a paper, leaving a paper trail. If you've got authorized signatory access to a digital wallet, you can move that money in nanoseconds. So in that respect, there's a whole hierarchy of issues that come from authorized signatories, and I refer you to our paper there where we refer to end-from-end signature schemes that are used to effectively protect an organization against such digital fraud. A lot has been said about money laundering and tax evasion on the blockchain, and in this respect, there is an obligation on auditors to focus on transaction monitoring, identification, verification, and payments. So I'm not going to sensationalize the fact that there's money laundering that does take place and tax evasion that does take place. It takes place everywhere in the digital world as well as in the real world. So you can sort of get all terribly upset that this is happening with blockchain, but you can also get terribly upset that it's happening in plain view in the City of London with some of the world's most known banks. And so in that respect, I would just suggest that actually this is something which is a matter of policing. Obviously, for the auditor, you want to ensure that this isn't happening in the organization that you're auditing. So with the blockchain, as I said, it's computer code. With computer code, you can actually write instructions into that code. So you can write smart contracts, contracts that automatically execute when something has happened. So, for example, when I receive money into my digital wallet, automatically distribute it so that all my contacts get their share, equitable share of whatever profit agreement we have made. That's a smart contract. That is automatic, and it can be written into the blockchain at any point. Also, it could say release the money, say, in a week or in a year or in 2 years. So you can have time-locked contracts. So when you're looking at 10,000 words of code and there's a time-locked contract in there in just one of those lines of code, immediately you can see the problem. The auditor has to not only understand the code, but has to be able to understand where a smart or time-locked contract can change the materiality of these accounts as to who accruals are due to or where contractual obligations lie. So a giant minefield, and not one that's going to be easily addressed other than to have blockchain specific or programming specific auditing professionals in the future. And this is somewhere where I think we're leading the way in Scotland, because we're thought leading on this. We, from a historical point of view, led with accounting and accounting standards. And I think that this is something which can really differentiate, talking about Digit's mission here, really differentiate ourselves in Scotland from other jurisdictions who perhaps aren't thinking about these things and aren't addressing them at this early stage in what is the rollout of digital assets. So I've talked about smart contracts. Actually, theoretically, you could even have an organization with no legal structure. In other words, you could effectively use smart contracts to both manage and distribute, take the customers, take the revenue and so forth, and it can all be on the internet with no liability structure, and actually can avoid many jurisdictional structures. These are called digital autonomous organizations. And this is a real threat to the way that actually we conduct business onshore, and something which presents an audit challenge if an organization starts to adopt these. Now, at the moment, these are largely theoretical. There are a few used by people who are developing and processing crypto assets and, for example, digital content like music or film or whatever. But at the moment, these are largely in the domain of this is interesting, what are we going to do about it? That's why we have to think about it now, because it is an interesting concept and it will get wider adoption. The other issue we have to worry about, and this is an auditing issue for the physical world as well as for the digital world, is third-party control. But obviously third-party control with digital assets is far more of an issue. So for example, you decided to give your children assets like Bitcoin for Christmas. Well, that's great, but obviously they can't own the account in their own name, so you hold it for them. You've got third-party control over those Bitcoins. The same can be said for an organization or whatever. It might be that you're holding it in escrow for someone as part of a legal transaction. And so in that respect, how do you determine what third-party control is in a crypto wallet that hasn't got the same effectively processes and functions that you'd have in traditional finance? And at the moment, that's just a matter of, this is an industry in its infancy, but obviously third-party controls are something that auditors always insist on tightening up. So if the third-party control isn't there, you will get, and you're handling digital assets, you'll probably get a note on your audit report signing off your audit saying that actually there are weaknesses that need to be addressed. Verifying addresses, as I said, you've got your blockchain with a code that's cryptographically linked. Each link has an address. I've put a whole bunch of addresses here just to show the magnitude of the problem. These are not easy to determine as to who or what should own them. You can probably create code to do that, but then is that code also secure? And likewise, private keys can be transferred as well from one party to another. And in that respect, there's a whole approach. Now, you can't verify everything, but that's the same in traditional audit. What you do is you address it by sampling. So with all these codes here, you would probably sample 1 in 3 and see that they're correct. So it's more, from an auditor's point of view, important to set up a proper sampling approach so that you do actually do what is called stratified sampling of the various addresses. So I've rushed through this because I didn't want to go into the technical detail. I'm happy to address those in the questions. But in conclusion, audit risk is what the auditor has to worry about. He's got to worry about the inherent risk in the blockchain. And as you've heard, that risk is in the programming itself. So he's also got to worry about the detection risk. In other words, detecting material misstatement. What I was talking about, the fraud and so forth, and smart contracts and time-locked contracts. So in terms of the audit risk, the auditor has to understand the nature of how these digital assets are moving in order to be able to ensure that there's no fraudulent activity taking place. To do that, you need substantive procedures. And as I've said, digital transactions have these issues on the visibility, the malleability, the embedded code, and the verification, which is why traditionally an audit takes place and an IT audit is a subcomponent of that audit, but why I believe that we need to have standards and protocols to address digital audit in the future. Because as you can hear, it's changing quite dramatically. And as the whole of finance migrates to have more and more digital assets and less physical assets, we are going to have to address these challenges whether we like it or not. And the way an auditor addresses these challenges is through test and control. So there are 3 areas where you can use technology to help with this. So that's the good news. You know, I talked a lot about challenges, but actually transaction monitoring in a digital world is automated for you. I've already talked about self-verification. Identification is a matter of a key, a code, and so we can get identification. We're not doing KYC to know who something is. Obviously, KYC is still an important part of any financial system. And as I was said, payments and cryptocurrencies are becoming more and more the norm, and we are actually moving to a world where in this year, 2021, we're going to see the launch of the first digital currency from a central bank digital currency. It'll be probably the one, the Chinese. They've been testing this en masse. It looks robust. The Japanese likely to come next. They've also got a fairly robust digital one. Sadly, in the UK, we're still at the consultancy phase on a digital pound, although this actually represents a challenge for an opportunity for Scotland, because maybe Scotland could launch a digital pound because we can put money in escrow against deposits held in the Bank of England, and we can do that digitally. So a lot of things to think about. So there you have it. Audit is changing. It's changing to real time. It's changing to a decentralized world, and we need new standards to address that. So I've left some time for questions, and I'll let the moderator take over on the questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks a lot. Those are really passionate topics, and that was great to have them to kickstart this digital summit. So we will enjoy, yes, actually your presence a few minutes more to take care of our audience's questions. So this is our Q&A session, and we already received some during your presentation, so thank you to the audience for that. I have the first one for you, Daniel. You were talking about this whole new word, and are the traditional auditors equipped to handle this new word? And if not, do we need a new type of auditor?
I don't think traditional auditors are equipped. I don't think traditional auditors, in terms of their IT outsourcing, are actually addressing digital assets as such. They're still addressing things like security protocols and so forth. So I think that this is a gigantic challenge. The accounting bodies themselves have some working groups that are addressing this, but they're working groups. They aren't working towards a standard as such. And I think that we here in Scotland could call for that. I think that it's important enough for our future for us to actually be thought leaders in this and say, look, guys, the world is changing. We need to do something about it.
Second one, HM Treasury is currently calling for evidence on crypto asset regulation. How do you think this will play out, and what could it mean for the UK economy?
Yeah, so not just in the UK, but many jurisdictions are looking at effectively how to regulate crypto assets and particularly cryptocurrencies. There's some that consider them assets, some that consider them commodities, like America, and some that have outright banned them. I think in the UK, we're going to be more accommodating. So again, there's a consultation out. So I'm extrapolating the sort of general mood. But I think that we want to be accommodating to cryptocurrencies in the UK, but that we want to have an adequate anti-money laundering and know your client protocol superimposed over them. And we want to have custody protection. I mentioned the sub-custody challenges. So I think that we will probably see that there will be some form of legislation at some stage, but I don't think that it's coming immediately following the consultation, because although we're ahead of the curve in the regulation of FinTech and other aspects like that, in terms of digital assets, we have a bit of a challenge. And that's largely because in England, not in Scotland, by the way, if you make a transaction according to law, you need to actually have a physical asset payment. In other words, that's why you have a peppercorn payment or whatever. There has to be a physical transfer of something to make the contract valid. Here in Scotland, a handshake will do, and a digital handshake can be easily accommodated by the regulators. So again, something that Scotland can do that effectively can push the agenda here that maybe might not happen south of the border.